Former NRECA President CEO Glenn English chose Mike Williams to chair the 21st Century Committee because of his distinguished background. A background that includes strategic planning, association management, and understanding of our cooperative principles. Through Mike's adept leadership, the committee explored the core of our cooperative program and looked for answers to these tough questions. If the cooperative program did not already exist, would it be a viable business model today? And what is the cooperative's purpose? Here to discuss the 21st Century Committee report and convey the cooperative's vision for the future, please welcome Mike Williams.
Good morning. Thank you. Well, Dwayne, I didn't realize you were going to be such a hard act to follow. I'm really honored that you asked me to spend part of your morning with me. I'm going to tell you probably a lot of things that you already know. And the first thing I want to tell you is I get a chance to travel all around the country, and I work with my fellow statewide managers from over 40 states. And there's none better than Dwayne Nolan. I am very proud. When Dwayne came to the electric cooperative program, he raised the bar for all of us, and I just want to thank you for that, Dwayne. Let me tell you just a little bit about myself. My wife, Julie, and I have been married for about 18 years. We are the proud parents of a 16-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. By the way, my son got his driver's license last Friday, 8:30 in the morning. Had his first accident at 12 noon. Not driving quite as much today. A few years ago, we live in a kind of a hilly neighborhood, beautiful rural area, relatively close in, but it doesn't lend itself well to riding a bike or walking to school, so the kids take a bus. And our kids were lucky; they were at the tail end of the bus schedule for quite a few years. They had to catch the bus just before 8 o'clock. And then they changed the schedule, and our kids were at the beginning of the schedule of being picked up. And it caused everybody to have to get up about an hour earlier in the morning. And frankly, it caused a lot of chaos at breakfast. I watched this chaos for several weeks. I watched the way my wife prepared breakfast. I'm kind of a process guy. I observed that there were quite a few efficiency improvements, ways that my wife could get breakfast on a little more quickly than she was doing. So I framed out my proposal. I delivered that to my wife. You may be wondering how that turned out. It used to take my wife 20 minutes to get breakfast on in the morning. Now it takes me 20 minutes. When we were asked as a committee to take this thorough, deliberative look at the future of the electric cooperative program, we all began with one premise. I know I did. I felt very strongly about this. We weren't all going to go off, even though we had a very diverse group of men and women, directors, managers, staff people from all across the country, and some amazing staff. We weren't going to go off and figure out how to be successful and come back and tell everybody how to do that. What I've learned, and I learned this experience with my wife, I've learned it many times over, is nobody really needs to be told what to do. But one thing that I have learned in my life is that some of the very best advice I ever got was about things that I already knew. Ever had that happen? You knew that, but somebody just had to remind you to confirm that that was good advice. There's a guy named Eric Hoffer. He said, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." Ever know anybody like that? Had it all figured out, right? Lived a good, productive life, but didn't realize that the world around them had changed a little bit. It happens a lot. It happens with people, and I think it happens with organizations sometimes. It has a lot to do with phenomena of knowledge. I don't know if you've noticed or not, but I've learned that the more I know, the more I realize how much there is to know. It's just the way knowledge is. Unfortunately, there's a corollary sometimes, which is the less I know, the less I realize how much I don't know. Now, there's a guy named Jim Collins, who's one of my favorite business writers. Some of you may be familiar with him. He wrote a book called Built to Last, Good to Great, but his favorite work of mine is a book called How the Mighty Fall. And Dr. Collins and his team studied organizations, very successful organizations, that had been successful for a very long time and then weren't. And he said, is there a pattern here? Because it would sure be nice to know, right? If you could look at people who hadn't done well, what could you learn from that? And they did, in fact, find a pattern. What they discovered were there were 5 discrete sequential steps that most organizations went through on their way to their demise. There are 5, but the first, I think, is the most important. And they called it hubris born of success. Hubris born of success. It's simply the notion that because we've been successful, we think we will be successful in the future. And as you know, that doesn't always work out. Success is a pretty good determinant of our future success, but it doesn't guarantee it. What I think both these gentlemen were saying is some of the most successful people and the most successful organizations have recognized it's important to have a willingness and a capacity to adapt to a changing world. I've learned this in business, I've learned it in my personal life. I'm not a big drinker, but I was out downtown Austin. Some of our members, Austin is very aggressive, as I'm glad they are, about enforcing DWI and DUI laws. I felt like I'd had a little too much to drink. I called a cab. Figured I'd take a cab home. Sure enough, on the way home, I went through a sobriety checkpoint. Because I was in a cab, they waved me right on through. Well, this was kind of curious to me, because when I got home, one, I didn't know where I got the cab, and I'd never driven one. I'm willing to adapt. I don't know about you. I'll tell you what, you wake up the next morning, yellow cab is hard to hide. It's very conspicuous. I want to ask you a question. I think it's an important question. We've had a long, successful history, as pointed out by Dwayne and others here already this morning. Do you think, though, that the next 75 years are going to look just like the last 75 years? What do you think? How many of you think the next 75 will look like the last 75? Probably not, right? They're going to be a little bit different. And why is that really important? The industry that I've grown up in, and I've been in the electric business now for over 30 years, has been a relatively stable one. But I suspect that we're about to see some fairly significant changes, much of it driven by technology. But our consumers, our members are expecting more, expecting higher performance from us because they get it all around them. And I think it's important to be candid here. We have had a very successful history. The committee recognized this. But let's look at the past 75 years. This co-op business model works really well. I think you'd agree. It does, however, sit on what I like to refer to as a three-legged stool. And the 3 legs on the stool, for most of us, we've had a protected service territory, right? Service territory laws in the state usually guarantee us, they recognize that we've been natural monopolies. So we generally are the only ones that can provide electricity, at least the way we've been providing it, to our members. That's one leg. The second leg is that we are cooperative, nonprofit organizations. And whether we've been regulated or self-regulated, we generally get to charge reasonable rates. I was a regulator for 6.5 years. I don't remember the commission ever telling a co-op that they had to charge less than their cost of doing business. And the third thing that is really important, you see a lot of industries affected by this, is at least for the time I've been in this business, we've never been capital constrained. That hurts a lot of industries, as we've seen, especially back just even 6-8 years ago, when our economy was hurting as bad as it was. A lot of organizations just simply couldn't get money. I'm not aware of any distribution co-op, at least, who was denied a loan necessary to make improvements to provide safe, affordable, reliable electricity. We have some great financial partners, RUS, CFC, CoBank, and others. Now, is it possible that all these legs will be okay in the future? And if not, maybe which one might be the most vulnerable? And I submit to you that perhaps the most vulnerable leg in this three-legged stool will be that protected service territory. Not necessarily because changing territory laws is high on any legislative agenda, but that there are players out there in the world who look at the market that we serve. This is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year electric market in just this country alone. And if I'm Microsoft, Google, Best Buy, Home Depot, Lowe's, and the list goes on, even Apple, they're looking at this market and saying, I'd like a share of that, maybe just a small share. So again, don't have to change any service territory laws. And we have consumers who now are more aware of some of the options out there. And you don't have to change territory laws to sell one of our members something that either makes electricity, kilowatts, or something that saves electricity, megawatts. And that could be where our greatest vulnerability is in the future, in an area where our committee spends some time. Something else that we thought mattered a lot, and I guess I've known this for a long time, but I didn't know exactly how to say it. It's another of my favorite writers, a guy named Peter Drucker, who once said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think what Drucker was trying to say was, strategy is really important, but the most successful organizations, they wake up every day, and they wake up knowing why they exist. They know what their purpose is, and everybody comes to work knowing what needs to be done. And I spent a lot of time in my professional life. I've been blessed with the opportunity to work with a lot of boards and management teams facilitating strategic conversations. And I think we've done a lot of good. But I'll tell you what I've seen mostly is I've seen those boards and management teams go through that process, but unfortunately at the end, many times, the organization doesn't really know what's important because those conversations are either not shared as well as they could be, or maybe even not shared at all. Culture is what we do every day. And good culture, I think, is the result of really knowing why you exist, knowing what your real purpose is. If you didn't exist, would it matter? Now, strategy matters, but a great strategy without a compelling purpose, well, it's like a beautiful highway that doesn't lead anywhere that people want to go. And purpose does something else in an organization. It inspires. I don't know about you, I like to have motivated people around me. But if you ever noticed, at least in the sports world, and I think this is true in business as well, motivated organizations or teams do well, but inspired teams perform at a much higher level. Inspired sports teams consistently win. And one of the things that helps people get that focus and get inspired is knowing why they exist and what difference we're making in the world. Now, I don't know if any of you have attended any of the recent NRECA either director conference or CEO meetings. I hope you have. They're great meetings, and NRECA does a wonderful job in education and training. On both of those programs was a friend of mine from Austin, Texas. Her name is Haley Rushing. And Haley and her colleague, Roy Spence, both worked with our 21st Century Committee in the early going, especially at the first meeting, spent about a day with us, having a conversation about purpose and about why this electric cooperative program really exists, and would it matter if we didn't? And Haley told me a story not too long ago that I wanted to share with you because it really resonated with me. Haley used to work for another ad agency, and she said a lot of their clients would come to them with stuff they wanted to sell, and they'd want the company to put a fancy badge on it and develop an interesting, persuasive ad campaign. She said, we did that, we did it okay, but then she moved to GSD&M. And one thing she discovered at GSD&M, in fact, Jim Collins helped them with this discovery, was that that organization seemed to be attracted clients that already knew their purpose. They understood why they existed. And she said, you know, it's so much easier to convince somebody to buy your stuff or your services when you know what kind of difference you're trying to make in the world. And it struck me as this kind of inside-out approach, and it was really very much about us. And let me explain. I had a great mentor in my life, a guy named Dr. Stephen Covey. I was fortunate to spend a little bit of time with Dr. Covey and his family, especially his son, also Stephen, who wrote a book called Business at the Speed of Trust. And Dr. Covey wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think it was probably 25, 30 years ago now. And I've always been interested in self-improvement, as I'm sure most of us are, and a lot of the things I was reading at the time weren't very satisfying. They struck me as more superficial. The highlight of that, or low light if you will, was a book I read by a guy named Larry Ringer, who wrote Winning by Intimidation. It was all about how you made yourself look bigger, smarter, maybe faster than you really were. And then I picked up the 7 Habits. And Dr. Covey's approach, again, nothing terribly original, just accumulated a lot of good thought and philosophy from around the world, was a completely different approach to the whole idea of self-improvement. It was more an inside-out approach. It wasn't about trying to look better. It was trying about being better. It was trying to become the person you were intended to be, to discover your true purpose. There's a gentleman whose name escapes me frequently, as it does right now, who once said there's 2 important days in your life. One, probably most important, the day you were born. You know what the second is? It'd be a lot of things. But it could be the day that you discover your real purpose in life. What were you meant to do? You were put on this earth to make a difference. And that's what Covey helped millions of people do, in my opinion. He said, let's focus on what your purpose is. Let's get healthy. And then let's go out in that interdependent world and make a difference. Well, as you can tell, we thought that purpose was awfully important, and we focused on that considerably in the report if you've had a chance to read it. But let me shift gears for a minute now to some of the findings in the report. And notice I said findings and not recommendations. I think it's important that you understand that the committee felt it was important to take this thorough, deliberative look, lay some things out there, and let you have the conversation about what fit your circumstances the best. And again, most of these are pretty obvious. The first is that electric distribution cooperatives are the center of our co-op universe. Now, I know that probably sounds pretty obvious, maybe almost silly, but let's face it, there are a lot of important groups in the co-op family. This statewide is awfully important. NRECA is awfully important. We have a lot of financial and technical partners that are co-ops in this co-op family. We have some wonderful G&Ts who do a marvelous job of what they do. But all of us depend on the distribution co-op being successful. You're the one that has the retail relationship with your member. If you're successful, all of us are successful. If you're not, we're not. Now, I know that seems obvious, but we discovered, and perhaps you've heard of this, it isn't true necessarily, I don't think, in Illinois, but in some parts of the country, that relationship has been turned on its ear a little bit. Sometimes the statewide gets to be too important, or the G&T, the world revolves around something other than the distribution co-op. We thought it was important to point that out and to at least have a conversation about it. We also thought it was important to point out that all of this revolves around our own members, right? The distribution co-op doesn't exist unless our members are happy. And if you look at the history that we've had with our own members, it's been mostly a good one, but the history has been mostly along these lines. You want electricity, you can get it from me. If you want more, I'll make more. But today that might not be the case because of evolutionary, if not revolutionary, technology advancements. Consumers are more aware. They're more aware of options. There are non-traditional players in the marketplace who wouldn't mind selling our members either some kilowatts or some megawatts. And so our consumers are becoming smarter, better informed. And one of the things that we have a bit of a blind spot about, we thought as a committee, is the notion that price matters. Absolutely, electric prices, what we charge per kilowatt hour per kilowatt, really does matter. But most customers, and I tell you, I fall in this category as well. I'm not sure if you held a gun to my head right now, I could tell you what my price per kilowatt hour is from my provider. But I know what I paid on the bill last month. And that's what a lot of customers or our members are looking at. And there are a lot of solutions companies, again, non-traditional competitors, who figure that out and are offering solutions in terms of kilowatts and megawatts to our members. We also thought that it's helpful to be as technology neutral as you can, and this is really kind of a tricky one. We have made, as you know, this is a very capital-intensive industry characterized by long planning horizons and a lot of regulatory or business risk out there because of who knows what the Congress might do or EPA or anybody else. But it gets real tricky when we overcommit to certain technologies and then ask our members to choose sides with us. And it's necessary sometimes, and it's part of the political, rolling up your sleeves and doing what we got to do politically. But there's one example that jumped out at me lately that demonstrates some of the potential pitfalls and dangers of doing that. Anybody familiar with the situation in Boulder, Colorado? Boulder's a unique community, but they are served presently by an investor-owned utility. And they're not happy with the strategy of that investor-owned utility, specifically with respect to their environmental position and a number of other things. And the IOU that serves them happens to use a lot of coal. Nothing wrong with coal. Coal ought to be part of the all-above strategy, right? We all agree on that. But this community doesn't like it, and the vast majority of the people there have decided to vote in favor of beginning a condemnation process. Now, could be they're just trying to get leverage. I haven't seen too many successful municipal takeovers in a long time. I actually represented cities for a long time. Very seldom does that happen. It usually goes the other way. But here's a community that said to the utility, I don't like your fuel choices, and we're going to do something about it. And if you don't change, and the IOU is not in a position to change, and I don't think they really want to, they're going to try to run them out of town and take over the utility themselves. Now, that's kind of an extreme case, but I've seen other places, and the committee observed this as we traveled around and heard stories, a couple up in Michigan, one down in Florida, where just a handful of our members decided they didn't like our strategy. They didn't like some of the choices we were making, and they didn't feel like we were listening to them. So what did they do? They ran for the board. And in some cases, given low voter turnout, which is it's just awful all across the country. I don't know very many places where we get more than 15, 20, maybe 30% turnout in local elections. But in this co-op election, there were two people who had an environmental background that got elected to the board. You think that boardroom changed a little bit, the dynamic and the discussions? It sure did. Well, let me talk about social media for a minute. Any of you wonder what it might be like to read other people's minds? I used to wonder about that. And then I got on Facebook a couple of times. Now I'm over it. Now, I didn't say Facebook's a bad thing, right? I think Facebook is a fabulous thing. I think Joanne Emerson is doing a fabulous job with it, with communicating with co-ops and people across the country. I just don't have any interest in it. I just don't want to know if you just went to get a cup of coffee or you went somewhere. And I'm not saying that Joanne does that, but I had some people that I was following for a while, and I'd get these little emails or whatever it was that tell me all these little things that I didn't need to know. But I want to tell you, social media is huge. It is huge. It is the way this next generation is beginning to communicate. It's a way we're doing business. It is even changing the landscape, the geopolitical landscape. Customers have a lot of information. They have a lot of choices for a lot of things in their lives these days. Now, I've been in the electric business a long time, like probably a lot of you. I don't find electricity very interesting. I kind of want to know about it, but it's just not that sexy. I just don't care. There are a lot of other things, though, that I care to shop for. What I really want to know, and this is important, is who can I trust? Can I trust you so I don't have to think about it? And that's something that I want to talk about for just a few minutes. But let me ask you a question first. Do you consider your co-op a first-class energy provider? I've worked with a lot of co-ops over the years all across the country, and I've never seen one that wasn't really good at providing safe, affordable, reliable electricity. But let me ask you a follow-up question. Can you be a first-class co-op energy provider if the communities that you serve are decaying or dying, if jobs are leaving, if the schools are getting bad, if there's not adequate water, telecommunications, and other infrastructure? It's not easy, is it? We're not like the investor-owned utility, which may just simply close down some district offices if a community's not doing too well. Unlike those IOUs, we live there. And there's a bottom line to this. And I like to say, you can't sell electricity to a wide spot in the road. And I live in a big state, and I've seen some areas that were pretty healthy, and then all of a sudden they're not. And they literally do become wide spots in the road. We're having another boom because of shale gas right now. But that's only a matter of time before that plays out. Our final report suggests a starting point for a discussion about our future. Not saying that everybody ought to adopt this purpose statement, but we suggest that a good starting point for the discussion is to power communities and empowering our members to improve the quality of their lives. Now, as I heard my friend Dwayne Nolan say a little while ago, we've always been in the quality of life business, I think. The most visible demonstration, however, has been safe, affordable, reliable electricity. But think about life before electricity. It was not much fun, and we really were in the business of improving the quality of people's lives. Now, this doesn't mean, as I might have suggested a minute ago, that you have to be in the water business or the telephone business or any of these other things, these crucial infrastructure businesses. Many of us lived through the technology convergence days of the 90s. And we saw a lot of utilities, IOUs, co-ops, and others who got into other businesses that weren't very good at it. And it's not necessarily a good idea or a bad idea. You have to decide for yourself. But there's no escaping the fact that if the areas that you serve don't have adequate water, and we actually have some towns that are running out of water and have run out of water in Texas, you don't have good schools, you don't have adequate health care, you don't have these other things, that the end may be in sight for those communities, and that we ought to be part of at least being a catalyst for discussions about how we improve those things. Now, bottom line for our report, we seriously had to sit down and say, look, do we really think that electric utilities, electric co-ops specifically, can be successful in the 21st century? Clearly the answer is yes. But one important condition, and that's being ourselves. And folks, this has to do with something kind of personal and about relationships. Think about this. if Dwayne and I didn't know each other, and we met today, and we began a friendship, and Dwayne got to know me. He knew that I meant what I said, did what I said I was going to do. He knew he could count on me, and that I genuinely cared about Dwayne and his family and things important to him. Over time, what would happen? What's one word to describe the feelings that Dwayne might have towards me? Trust. Yeah, thank you. Trust. That's kind of the first thing, right? And then over time, continue that relationship, and something else happens. After that trust develops, if I have something in my life that I need Dwayne's help, there's another dynamic that develops. Not only does Dwayne trust me, we have a loyalty to each other. We watch each other's backs, right? We have a genuine trust and loyalty. And this happens in personal relationships, but I'm here to tell you that it also happens with organizations as well. It's equally transferable. If there's an organization that truly cares about you, they're trying to make a difference in your life, and you know that, and it's genuine, it's authentic, you will trust them. And then you will have a certain degree of loyalty towards them. I described an experience I had with a large airline not too long ago. Hard to imagine thinking that an airline actually cared about me. But I thought they did a pretty good job, and frankly, I got really loyal to them, and they got into a political fight over a fairly large business decision they were making down in Houston, Texas. And I walked into a friend's office who was helping Southwest Airlines at the time, and I found out about it. And you know what my response was? I didn't want to know any details. I just want to know, how can I help my friends? It's that kind of loyalty. And think about that when we are in the political arena, and Joanne and the folks at NRECA do a marvelous job of this at NRECA. I know Dwayne does and his team here in Illinois. I like to think we do in Texas. But why is it that we're able to be effective in the political arena? It is true. We were born here, we'll die here. But I'll tell you, the single most important thing that we can do to improve our political potency, bar none, in my opinion, is do what we do best. You want to get people on your side, all you have to do is do a good job, genuinely, authentically care and take care of your members, and you'll have people jumping out of their seats in the state capitol and the U.S. Congress trying to help you because they see you as allies in the community. Now, it's important to do all these other things. You better be a part of the political process. Know your elected officials and participate financially as much as you can. But the single most important thing that I think we do is do what we do well best. Now a guy named Simon Sinek has written extensively about purpose-inspired organizations. Something he said really struck me, and I thought it was important. Some of you, if you've attended the CFC meeting, not this last year, but the year before, probably saw Simon speak. He said, people don't necessarily buy what you do, but why you do it. People don't necessarily buy what you do, but why you do it. And this is where the loyalty comes from. Okay, think about this. You buy things, you buy them because you think there's value in it. But if you have a choice between buying a product or service from an organization, everything else being equal, you'll choose the one that you believe really cares about you. It's their why. It's their real purpose. Now, a way to maybe say this differently is what engages the mind. But it's the why that wins the heart. My friend Roy Spence, who some of you have seen at some NRECA annual meetings, I thought said it well in his book called, "It's not what you sell, it's what you stand for." It's not what you sell, it's what you stand for. Now, like it or not, there is a tremendous amount of transparency in the world that we live in. People have access to vast amounts of information, and as a result, they ask more of us and in the end expect more. How many of you knew, by the way, what a 990 was just 5 or 6 years ago? I didn't even know there was such a thing. But somebody got interested in that, right? And I'll bet all of you now know what a 990 is and what ought to be in a 990. Well, how do we ensure that we meet those expectations? Well, I think there's at least 2 things that I wanted to talk to you about this morning in closing. The first is a leadership quality that I think is probably the most important. And there are a lot of things that leaders, and everyone that's sitting in this room is a leader. You wouldn't be here, right? And there's lots of things that you ought to know, and you ought to be confident, and you ought to be competent and confident. But I believe that the single most important quality that leaders need, and mostly gets overlooked, is one thing, and it's humility. Best leaders I've ever known had a good dose of it. And it wasn't that they weren't confident, they didn't know what they were doing, but they understood this phenomenon of knowledge. The more I know, the more I realize how much there is to know, and that we could be wrong. And the things that we have been doing weren't necessarily wrong, but they might not fit the circumstances that we live in today. And so humility, I think, is awfully important because it gives us the capacity to recognize that the world around us, our members, regulations, social mores, any number of things, technology, may have changed and gives us the ability to recognize that. The second thing that I think is important and that we spend a lot of time on as a committee is it's important, critical in fact, as a family of co-ops to recognize and embrace our diversity by living the co-op principles, especially that 6th one, cooperation among co-ops. You know, the beauty of this co-op family is, and most of us are, you can be small, in fact, you can be real small, but plug into a vast, national, powerful network and be big and really smart at the same time. And think about some of the more colossal failures in the co-op program, and frankly, several of them occurred in my home state. Co-ops that didn't do so well at a point in time stubbed their toe in a big way. And one of the big drivers was they just thought it wasn't cool to be a co-op anymore. They didn't want to be like a co-op. They wanted to be like the power companies. And they ran away from being a co-op. In fact, in some cases, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad idea, many of them even took co-op out of their name. Well, as you can tell, I'm kind of a big fan of Roy Spence. He's been kind of a mentor to me and a dear friend. If you've heard Roy speak, you may have heard him tell the story about when he was a young man. He read a poem by Robert Frost. The poem was Yellow Road Through the Woods. 2 roads diverged in yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, long I stood, or be one traveler, long I stood. And Roy said it took him quite a few years to figure out what that meant to him. And he said he finally figured it out. He said, you become what you look for. On one road, if you look for enemies, you'll find them. Gossip, it'll consume you. Hate will live in your heart, and fear will follow you everywhere. On the other road, if you look for friends, you'll be befriended. Love, it'll lift you up. Truth will set you free, and hope will take you straight to higher ground. Now, humans, all of us, have a strong confirmation bias. Our analytical mind can always conjure up potential trade-offs and potential conflicts. And we begin to see what we're looking for. You look for the bad things in the world and you'll find them. It's also true, though, that if you look for synergies, you are likely to find those as well. And if you look for ways to to cooperate with each other, my guess is you'll find them. One of the 7 habits of highly effective people is synergy. It's the notion that 1 and 1 is not 2, 1 and 1 is 3. And that's something that we think we've demonstrated in this cooperative program for over 75 years. And essentially, this is all about this cooperation among cooperatives. And I've been in the association world now a long time. It's about finding common ground on higher ground. We all know you get down into weeds, there's lots of reasons for us to disagree. But the real challenge is finding that higher ground, a place where we can all come together and cooperate and provide and achieve those synergies. You know, in life, I found there's sort of 2 approaches, 2 mentalities. One is sometimes referred to as a scarcity mentality. Not enough to go around, so I got to get mine. The other is an abundance mentality. There's plenty to go around. The best conscious leaders, in my opinion, are merchants of hope and entrepreneurs of meaning. Co-op country has really always been about hope, a belief that we could lead a better life, a belief that we could help our neighbors lead a better life. Some have even said we democratized the American dream for those living in the dark. Folks, this is our history, this is our heritage, and most importantly, we believe this is our future. Thank you.